we can start now this second session of our presentation of the common strategy that we as Transform Europe wants to held in order to support what should be the meeting of the Social Forum of Transformative Economies that is taking place in an online format instead of the real one that is supposed to be in these days in Barcelona. We hope to come back in a normal way and to see each other and to have a physical contact also, not only social contact, and to discuss this kind of things also in not only in the virtual form. But we keep it even in this form because we think it's important in these days, show that nothing is stopping us to continue to criticize what is going on and why we are in this situation now. That's why we started now this process of the commons in order to have this kind of point of view in the transition of our societies and our economies. We had the first webinar talking about the social justice and the social commons. What we see now nowadays is it's clearly that the necessity to have healthcare system, but also as public health system as a commons. And now we want to see how the commons are able to talk about an exit from the capitalist way to do things and offer the opportunity to talk about transition and just transition, not only in terms of social justice, but also in terms of ecological matter. So I stop here in order to give the floor to Birgit that will present the host that we had now in this webinar and to give the input to this discussion and to come back after the brief response of the speech of the speakers. I just want to tell you that we are online on our web page, in our Facebook page, and we are recording this video and we will put on our website as soon as possible. Thanks again, and Birgit, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Roberto. Thank you, colleagues. Since I think about 15 years, the discussion of commons is in the international debates, and the working group on commons from Transform Europe was, since some years, we are working on different aspects of commons. And with this tragic tragedy of this pandemic, we see a momentum that at least many people in the world experience this tragedy as a less and the tragedy what neoliberal politics and root capitalism is doing to their lives, and that a good and qualitative public and common healthcare system would have helped them to get through. And what we see too is that at least the majority of workers of the world have no social protection at all, and they are in the mess, and they are in this tragedy left alone completely. So I think, and we think, that we should discuss in this moment specifically what we have to do and to promote within the healthcare field with all its dimensions. But we have to reflect too on the development and the history of commons. I see there are many initiatives locally concentrated. It started with initiatives on access to clean water, initiatives all over the world on land and housing, initiatives on local levels where cities connect to work together on common projects. And we think that it's the moment, and there is a, let's say, brought into question the general question of public goods and services too, how they could be organized as commons means with the participation and the decision making, not and in full transparency with the citizens concerned. So this is the whole picture in a few words, and it's not giving much details. But what we see too is that the debate on just transition of our societies up to now is not really connected with the commons movements. Commons movements normally and are practical movements, step by step by step. They are fighting in communities to get solutions for their concrete problems. But what we need in a more, let's say, global or in a more universal view, we need to, how can we connect them? What would be the strategic needs? Who will be the partners we need to develop these different dimensions of commons and bring them into the debates of just transition? Because what is obvious is that the moment that is giving us this pandemic in his strategy is the moment for new steps of just transition in our societies too. So this is all I want to say. So it's a very large and deep going on the ongoing debate, so it's very few words about it. And I want to introduce to you our panelists. We have with us Judith Dellheim and Dario Azzellini and Hilary Wainwright. I will introduce every panelist when it's your turn. And I would propose that you make a shorter first statement of about 10 minutes or so that we have a second round and perhaps even a third round where you can refer to the arguments of the other panelists. So I introduce to you Judith Dellheim. Hello, Judith.
Hello.
Judith holds a PhD in political economy. Coming from the former GDR, she was one of the very early promoters of our new left in Germany after 1990, and she was working for the party a long time, and she was then at the starting point of the famous Rosa Luxemburg Foundation. She joined the former Rosa Luxemburg Foundation and worked for Rosa Luxemburg Foundation a long time. Actually, Judith is a research fellow of the Rosa Luxemburg Foundation, and she is member of the Euromemo group. And she was working. We know each other from many conferences and events concerning social economy, alternative paths of economy, and commons. So please, Judith, it's yours.
A great thank you to you, Birgit. I want to bring 5 points to the table. The first, the tension between the demand for conditions of a life in dignity for everyone and the mounting problems we face is continuously arising. This expresses the real strength or the weakness of the commons movements and the situation of the left in total. So we should ask, of course, why is this the case? The commons as common conditions for a life in dignity for everybody mean asking for peace and protection from violence against people, healthy food and clean drinking water, intact environment, democratic decision-making and self-determination, decent work, decent housing, medical treatment and medical care of high quality, education on a high level, sustainable mobility, free time. Consequently, peace as well as land with water as a basis for food, for living and housing constitute the basic elements of the conditions for a life in dignity. These basic elements are closely connected with each other, with their real and effective usage of self-determined individuals who are acting together in democratic and solidarity-oriented ways. Accordingly, we see a central role of the issue of property. Property as it is enabling social equality and justice, ecological sustainability, democracy, and the rational use of economic resources. And we see a clear interrelation between a consistent and consequent commons movement and other kinds of working for a radical systemic change. Firstly, however, the various common movements are only seldom linked amongst themselves. Secondly, they are only seldom united in working towards a radical systemic change. Thirdly, they are only seldom united in working in relation to all kinds of commons, especially in relation to the issues of peace, water, land, and knowledge. So, and the second point. The contribution of the commons movements to a just transition process, or I prefer to say, a socio-ecological transformation on the different levels of our societies depends, of course, on the specific movements and on the political conditions determining the work of these movements. I think that our Berlin Energy Table, which works on a democratic, social, ecological, and solidarity energy system in Berlin, but cooperates with other movements in Germany, in the EU, and joined the EU, is a good example for a movement what could develop real strength. We have started working in 2011, and we have reached the establishment of the development of a public enterprise for producing renewable energy, and we could achieve an increase of the capacity of the already existing public enterprise. We have been fighting for the recommunalization of the grids, and we have been able to influence on the political programs and the election campaigns of the Left Party, the Greens, and the Social Democrats. We are pushing their coalition to do what is necessary for achieving the necessary energy sense. But at the same time, we cooperate with as much as useful with this coalition, and we also try to cooperate as much as possible with the public enterprises. But above all, we closely cooperate with other social movements. But let's go global and look at the movements for free public transport in Brazil. The Left Party in Marica has realized such a project. The poor is very happy about this. Or let us look at the Coalition for Free and Accessible Public Transport in Toronto, which is a socialist project. The New Democrats have integrated its demands into their party program, and the Transport Workers Union has also adapted the idea. The question is therefore a multiple one. Do the movements have a concrete conception for solving real problems? Do they go beyond their immediate issue, or better, do they see this issue within the complex of problems of the societies, including the issues of property and of societal hierarchies? Do the movements go beyond their own starting context for being and acting in solidarity with others? And do they strive to develop societal political alliances in order to change the society? The third point, we need campaigns uniting us, not in contrast to the specific purpose we have established our movements for. I think on a campaign like Our Lives Belong Us, Our Lives Belong to Us. This could unify movements against war, against different phobias, and against any kind of discrimination of people, as well as against exploitation and oppression. Fourth, we need everybody, every institution, every agency, every organization which act in the direction towards just resolution of concrete problems like energy, property, and towards overcoming societal hierarchies or creating another world. But we have to be flexible in doing so. For example, for reaching a referendum, you need an alliance first. But for scandalizing an obstacle, you should start acting immediately, even at the risk of being ignored at first. Sometimes even left-wing parties and left-wing trade unionists only start to react or to act when challenged by activists of social movements. Maybe this is not an exception, but the reality and the normality. It means we need concrete plans and especially a political strategy oriented on target groups, and at the same time, the ability to react to upcoming events in a flexible way. Fifth, I think the starting point and the core principle for everything is solidarity. Solidarity with people who do need it because they are brutally oppressed, exploited, or victims of war. And solidarity with emancipative solidarity-oriented forces involved in specific struggles whose concrete battle is of high political strategic importance for changing the relations of forces in this very historical moment. Got examples for this are actions in solidarity with the refugees or the movements like Black Lives Matter. So let's do something concrete and discuss our experiences. I think that we need more discussions about practical experiences and then on this basis we could develop our strategies. So, and thank you for your attention.
So thank you, Judith. Just reminding Berlin and the development of the energy table and how it is often the case that commons start with one issue, and in the development of the project they develop other issues, so it's winning complex. And from there to the connection with transnational and international organizations, it's far. Thank you very much for reminding us that the not only let's say the intellectual international left community is not so advanced with commons debates, reminding us that our left partners in institutional politics too, we should develop more initiatives and more cooperation. Thank you very much, Judith. Now we come to Dario. Dario Azzellini is a member of the Commons Working Group of Transform Europe since the beginning, and even before. He has a long history of activism, and he holds 2 PhDs in American studies and
in sociology and in political science.
Thank you very much, Dario. That's good. It's so complicated.
Never mind.
So, actually, you are a visiting scholar in Latin American Studies program in Cornell University in Ithaca, still trying to survive in USA. You are a hero. And he has published many books, more than 1,000, and numerous other and 11 documentary films. And he is working since we are working together in the Commons Working Group, he is concentrating on the self-organization of workers in different parts of the world. So Dario, it's up to you.
Hello, Birgit. Thank you very much, and I'm happy to be here with Hilary and Judith, and greetings to Roberto, greetings to all the listeners. I don't think actually that we'll be so far away from each other with our ideas about the comments. So I want to try to maybe pick up a few of the things that Judith mentioned and look further at them, and also try to develop maybe some points she didn't go deeper into, but I think she also put on the table. First of all, I want to say that, I mean, we now speak about commons. I've worked in Latin America and in Latin America for like decades, and they always had commons and didn't name them as commons. So I was also a bit reluctant for quite a while to speak about commons because it looked like, oh, there's the new buzzword. But then at a certain moment you surrender to what the discourse is taking as main current, and you do it. And so I talk about commons too. But I think that we have to keep in mind one thing that is very important and that should differentiate an emancipatory, a leftist, a transformatory commons movement from a lot of commons concepts that are around, because there's a lot of talk about commons are best when there's no conflict. I would say there are no commons if there's no conflict. So the conflict is the base of the motor of development in society, and we can see that as soon as there is not the disponibility, I mean, first of all, the commons will not come in any field, and they did not come anywhere without conflict. Second, with the ones that don't want you to make the commons happen. If you get the commons granted, once you get them granted by whatever, the state or whatever, the moment they start to menace or threaten state or capital interests, you will be attacked again. And the commons will be abolished again. We experienced that over like the past 500 years that it has been like that. And it's no different now if we look at conflicts around commons in India, in Latin America, but also like in European core countries. So I think that it's very important to underline that there are no commons without conflict. There's no possibility to keep the commons without conflict. And there is no possibility that you don't get ripped off the commons again if you are not constantly ready to defend them. So that's, I think, point one, which means in the end, we can call it commons, we can call it non-state-centered socialism, we can find different libertarian socialism, whatever kind of expressions for it. In the end, it's with like, I think Wallerstein said once about the anti-systemic movements, like freedom in the end of oppression is only possible with a systemic change. So the commons are one path, and I think a path that can bring together many people in a clear way of a systemic change that distances from itself from concepts that have failed in the past. So totally state-centered, top-down ideas and concepts. The other idea of the commons of like kind of rank and file, council-based democracy, etc., always existed. But they were from a certain point, they were even for a while the only existing idea of social transformation. When Marx wrote about the Paris Commune and until the Russian Revolution, the only existing example and idea of revolution of social transformation was the Paris Commune as like greater area of commoning, I would say, like with the council-based democracy, with like the community control of institutions, of policing, of production, of everything. So then it changed and we got into an era where like representational ideas, state-centered models, etc., were predominant, not only in the left, but all over in society, and in the left too. And the left was modeled after these ideas, like the parties and the unions and etc. I think that we entered, starting in '68, with another, like, let's say, crucial point, with the Zapatista uprising that made it nourish, and then again with the, very clearly with the movements since the crisis in 2008, where like the other idea of transformation in society that is not state-centered, that is not top-down, is becoming like kind of the dominant, the more and more dominant idea of transformation of society. Which doesn't mean that it has immediately a solution, because I mean it took the party system or the representational system 100 years to impose itself, and it still didn't find the final solution to how to change things. So I'm just saying about like the tendencies. And I think it's also due to the globalization and all the changes that make people feel generally that they have less and less control about their lives and about everything that is going on. And that's where the comments come in. First of all, like if everything is globalized, there should be also like global rights, global access, and guarantees. And second, if everything is like kind of getting out of control, we have to put back control in the hands of the people. Democracy means that the control is in the people's hands and not somewhere else. What does it mean? I mean, I think that means, but it means also this is not like a complete, like, I'm not advocating for an anti-state movement or something. I'm advocating, and this is the strategy I can see by the movements, were movements that are against, within, and beyond the state, depending on how the relation of forces are and what the possibilities are. One major problem is you cannot, the state doesn't go away and lets you do the commons just because you ignore it or you're against it. On the other hand, there's inherent contradiction in the state about the question of control. So that's why we see that even like leftist parties that have good concepts and etc., once they're in power, the problem comes up that they want to maintain control of processes, of institutional processes, social processes, etc., and are reluctant to introduce fully like the commons dimension. Coming back to the question of the conflict and the commons is, I would say, so it means on one hand that if we want commons, it has one of them. We need several ways to act. Like I said, I mean, I think that the way to push the debate through the referendums, for example, in Berlin, what this possibility exists, it has been done like around the electricity table, around the airport, and now around the expropriation of big real estate companies is great. What we need is also direct action. I mean, direct action. If we want production to be put into collective hands, we have to occupy production places. If we want houses to be put in collective management, we have to pressure more by taking the houses. If we want the parks to be a public ground, we have to take the parks and make them public ground. Laws function the way that once practice is widely there, they will come and regulate it. So that's one thing. Second thing, I have the 3 points. Second thing that has been mentioned, we have to connect it with a just transition. It means we cannot be thinking about commons without thinking about everyone beyond borders, and about the right to everyone to have access to this kind of life and dignity and etc. Because otherwise we start creating privileged commons. Then there is soon no difference anymore. I mean, it's not a commons if a golf place is like a golf course is collectively managed. That's still not commons. So commons means also to think about everyone and to have this idea of equality, of justice in that, and justice between North and South. In between, and then also last point I want to mention here, the question of justice and of being aware of class, race, and gender, so that we don't start like creating. We have like nice work commons that are based on the thing that like women are still working at home and supporting all of that. Or we have a privileged commons access to whatever in the North because we live still from the exploitation of the global South, or it's we have like the commons collective on healthcare, etc., but like the refugees are excluded, or we close the borders. That cannot be. So this is also like a question that kicks in to have this broader look at the questions of class, race, and gender, and include them into the commons. That doesn't mean that everything has to be resolved at the same time. The commons are not a magic recipe, they're a path. Every path is full of contradictions and full of questions. We don't always have the answers at any time, but I think it is a path that can be, that we can walk along with many people, and that there are not only many contemporary initiatives, but there are also many connections with past histories and experiences existing still more in the global South than in the global North, but also still existing in the global North. We can call them like inter-migrant solidarity, you can call them solidarity, you can then call them in certain places, it's kind of a proletarian culture, in other places it's kind of a rural social networks, others is like new networks, etc. But it's not, we're not talking about something that has been transported into the future and we're going to wait for that until we get in paradise. But it's something that we have and start and do here and now. And I think that's the point from where on to develop. Thank you.
Thank you, Dario. You give me back the floor? Yeah?
Yes, sorry.
Okay, thank you. I find it rather important that you refer to the history, because in history we have many, and we have many times where people lived in the commons areas, and they still live. If I think at Mongolia, the whole country still is commons land, because the nomads are still living there. So there are still these islands of commons where they don't use it as a political argument. But what I think you said, we have to discuss inside the state and beyond. So I would like to ask Hilary, what are you thinking about the reshaping and the reconstruction of public within these new experiences we have now, public and state? You told me is a subject you were working on. Perhaps you can give us some reflections on that. Thank you, Hilary.
Okay, Birgit, thank you very much, and thanks Transform for inviting me. I feel a kind of connection with Transform for many years. And so, I like Dario, there's a lot in what Dario and Judith said, which I share, and I'm interested in our discussion. So, like Dario, I was initially a bit sort of suspicious or wary of the idea of the commons, because it quickly became this buzzword that was too vague and too sometimes apolitical, and it didn't have a clear sort of reference or context. Anyway, I thought about it, and actually I was very then involved in as you would imagine in Britain, fighting privatization. So for me, the question of the public and the state, without romanticizing the state, was very important against the market. So against marketization of the welfare state, we pushed the idea of democratization. And I was very influenced by, in my thinking about the commons and recognizing it was a useful concept with a very important history, I was very influenced by the whole movement in Italy against the water privatization. And which in some ways was about, it's a contradictory struggle, the fight against privatization, because on the one hand, one's defending the state, but on the other hand, you're uncomfortable about defending a state which you don't feel any real ownership of or sympathy towards. And so in Italy, they developed the concept, particularly coming from Tommaso Fortiori, who I hoped would be present, but he's not, because he's too involved in campaigning in Tuscany. So I wish him every success. So he developed this idea of commodification of the state as distinct from commodification. So in a way, learning from the concepts of the commons, particularly as Judith stressed, the idea of participation, to talk about really, in a way, it's another term for democratization. But I think it's deeper than democratization, because my understanding of the commons, going back to its history, is that it's not just about participation, it's not just about popular control over a public resource, it's also about contribution. So it's the idea that, you're contributing productively to the commons. The commons is a common resource to which the public, the people, are constantly contributing. So the whole original idea, the idea that came from Britain, the idea of common land, to which the people using that land would contribute to its fertility and its importance and social and ecological relevance by the way that they manage the land, they use the land, but always using it in a way that was reproducing its fertility and its nourishing capacity, rather than exhausting it. So that was a kind of idea of democracy that's productive democracy, an idea of participation that recognizes people's capacities and people's skills and people's harmonious relationship to nature. So I can see the importance of the commons if we think of it in the context not of opposed to the state, but of, in a way, reclaiming the state or attempting to democratize the state. And in that context, I think the history of it, at least my familiarity with the history in Britain is interesting. I hope it's interesting to others. I won't go into depth, but I think, you've got an interesting phenomenon in Britain where, it's a country which is both the location of a strong tradition of the commons. Peter Limberg talks about this, and, in a way, as Dario stresses, it was a site of conflict because, in the, not quite sure of my history, but the 17th, 18th century, when the beginnings of capitalism really, you had the conflict between the commons and the enclosure of the commons, which is in a way the first privatization of the commons, the enclosure of the commons by the sort of aristocracy that became, in a way, transformed itself into a capitalist class through the commodification of land. And then, in a way, the tradition of defending the commons, it sort of continued throughout and into the 19th and 20th century. So, in the 20th century, there was a long struggle over land, over countryside. I remember when I lived in the north of England, where there's some absolutely beautiful countryside that's absolutely next door, as we say in English, cheek by jowl, with the industrial, heartlands like Manchester and Sheffield. There were these beautiful, the Pennines, the Lake District, but this land was increasingly being enclosed and being bounded, so that people who wanted to walk, or as we say, ramble in this beautiful countryside at the weekend, it was like a physical emancipation from wage labor. You walked in the countryside and you were free. It was there's some beautiful songs about it, and it was a very symbolic idea. There was quite a close connection with socialism and the land and walking and rambling and climbing, and so there was at one point there was a ramble, a direct action. As Dario stresses, the point about the struggle over the commons is to create them and to defend them now, in the here and now. In a way, the state is in a way about an indirect, delegated struggle for the future, electing a socialist government and implementing a program, whereas the commons is about direct action, participation now, and defending and organizing the commons. But the question now is, like, as the state is under threat, the public sector, and now particularly the health service, we're seeing the consequences of privatization in the incapacity of the British state to really deal with the pandemic effectively and efficiently from a public good point of view. We see the consequences of privatization. So the question arises, is defending the state sufficient, or do we need to continue this struggle around the commons and expand it beyond land, which has been a strong tradition of common struggles in Britain, to health, to knowledge, to labour? I think labour is really a commons. And I think my argument would be that state ownership is a necessary but not a sufficient condition for the truly common ownership, the common control over public goods. We could call them common goods, like health, like education, like labour, like knowledge. So the health service would be a classic example of where, in some ways, it's been a public service, a state service, but the level of participation in it was very weak in the beginning. The ideas of public ownership in the 1945 government, which introduced the health service and many other public commodities, it never had a kind of participatory democratic vision. It was very state-led, very top-down, and sort of presumed that the public expert knew how best to run the institution. And in a way, we're now seeing the damaging consequence of that, because it actually meant that, in a way, the people, because they hadn't participated in this institution, in general, these public institutions, they weren't necessarily, they didn't identify with them. Now, in a way, the health service is a kind of peculiar exception to that, because although there was no formally democratic structures, in fact, because health is so basic to people's lives, in fact, there was a sort of a de facto informal participation. So, people would relate to their local hospitals very intimately, because they would have had their babies there, they would have taken their children there as they were growing up, they would have gone there as children, they would have taken their parents there, or the elders of the family, those who might have died there. So they had an intimate relationship that meant people felt a real, loyalty to the health service. So now you see during the pandemic that people are clapping or were clapping and feeling very, passionate about the health service. And so there is a kind of commons element built into it. So I wanted, if I've got a minute or two, just to kind of point to the ways in which the issue of the commons is coming to the fore in this, in the struggles around the pandemic. I mean, in a way, you had a moment, a very revealing moment, when even for the government, the health service was a priority. That very briefly, this utterly disgusting, monetarist, private, corrupt government put the health service first. I mean, in a way, the health service itself isn't an adequate vehicle for the health needs of the people. You need a wider concept of public health, which had been the responsibility of local government. But local government has been very much weakened and destroyed, and that contributed to the failure of the government to deal with the pandemic. But now, in the context of the easing of the lockdown, we see this very sharp contradiction between the public need of health and the imperative of the market, which is just basically, in a way, threatening people's health. So I think this is a time when we should be developing the idea of the commons, but very much in the context of commodifying the state and develop a more rich idea of democracy to include this idea of a deep, productive democracy that can change the nature of the state and turn it into a genuine commons, with the state safeguarding and a left government safeguarding the commons. I think the other thing we're seeing in the pandemic, another commons that's coming to the fore but needs developing and protecting in the face of the driving force of the market, which is now being unleashed in Britain and in many other countries, not post, but even during the pandemic, because the pandemic is going to last for at least a year until there's a vaccine. And that is the whole issue of knowledge. We're seeing how the knowledge of scientists is necessary, but governments are controlling and manipulating that knowledge because they don't want the people to share that knowledge. They don't want the people to actually have control of that knowledge. And so in Britain, we're seeing scientific knowledge being really manipulated in a way which is, I mean, most people can see it blatant. So now you have scientists who disagree, because in a way there's an ethical tradition amongst scientists. Not every scientist, but amongst many, radicalized by the movement against the nuclear bomb, against war in Iraq and chemical warfare. And those scientists have now got together and created an independent body around knowledge and science that challenges the government and advises the public in a way as much as trying to advise the government. And that's led to the development of a kind of popular knowledge. So people now, they say, we don't trust the government. We're making up our own mind to carry on with the lockdown, to carry on with our caution. People are wearing masks. People are actually not going out of their houses in the way that the government expects us to. Not everybody. Some people are rushing to the shops, but not everybody. So I think I should end really there by saying that now is a very important moment to be developing the kind of holistic campaigns that Judith and Birgit talks about, and to recognize the conflict which is going to intensify between the market and the return to normal, which is the normality of the market as the driving force, and to defend this brief moment we've had, this brief glimpse we've had of a society where health and the public good comes first.
Okay.
Okay.
Thank you very much, Hilary. We still have time for a second round, colleagues. And I wanted to add something to Dario and his concept of conflict. I think what Hilary, you are now stressing is that at the beginning of a commons initiative, there is the basic capacity of people to create something. It's not destruction, it's creation. And this is the basic thing in the ecological movements, that you want to create something and not to destroy. And if you want to create something and have an idea, then you probably go into conflict. You have to fight for it. And so I think these are, your two concepts are connected, one to each other. And I remember when many years ago, I think Daria was participating in Rome on a Rosa Luxemburg conference on commons. Michael Brie was giving a speech where he referred to the British commons situation in the 17th and 18th century. And this was very interesting because Hilary, this was part of the forced strategies to bring people into the fabrics, into the mines that they were that they had no more access to their land. And this is the same what you see in Africa, in India, in Latin America, where look to the indigenous people in the Amazonas, famous example. Where people are deprived of their traditional commons land, commons opportunities, dignity for the dignity of life, and it's a cynic and incredible system that we are surviving now. And it's true that we have this moment now with the pandemic, and people realizing that they need health care in a way that it is protected, that it is human, that it is respecting dignity, that it's not always, because not overall are these high technicized opportunities, but as we heard, Hilary, this afternoon from the example of Kerala, the region in India, that they were introducing a medical system where doctors were helping families and people, and that they were in full transparency and so on and so on. So there are methods, if you go democratic, if you go in transparent, if you have the dignity of people in really in your center, there are possibilities to develop it in another way. So that's my comment on that. And now I would like to ask who wants to refer to the others first. Judith?
Thank you. Some points. The first one, we don't use the term commons, we speak about common goods. Because in Germany, when you speak about commons, the intellectual think you want to discuss about books by Ostrom and have fans, which is not so extremely helpful. This commons debate, of course, in the global dimension, it has a different meaning than in Germany. So that's why we speak about Gemeingüter, common goods. Of course, I like very much the idea of conflict, because, of course, we have to start with a conflict. Our idea of the recommunalization of the energy system was a provocation and started with a conflict, of course, not only with the corporations, but also with the city council, the government of Berlin, and especially with the Social Democrats. Because when you look at the connections between Vattenfall, this is our main enemy, because Vattenfall tries to keep the grids. Yeah. So when you look at the revolving doors between Vattenfall and the former parliamentarians of the SPD and the former senators and administrators and the SPD, you can see a strong connection. And it was necessary to win the party basis of the SPD for getting in this conflict with their own people to start the referendum about the recommunalization of the energy system. So, and this was a permanent conflict, and it is really interesting that the party basis of the Social Democrats could win. So, of course, I like the idea, and I like the book by Hilary, Reclaim the State, but I think it is necessary also to think how Dario does. When you want to reclaim the state, you must also develop your forces beyond the state. Yeah, look, yeah, you mentioned, you stressed the issue of the health system. You cannot democratize the health system when you have not initiatives organizing health care for people outside the health system, especially people without papers and so on. Yeah, and you have to organize your solidarity structures beyond the state, and also to win progressive left peoples in the public administration to help the initiatives for organizing healthcare beyond the state structures, for giving assistance to people without papers. So I would come back also to the idea of public, because the issue of property is, of course, how to say, a special issue for people with a biography connected with the GDR or the socialist countries. Because why didn't the people fight for their public ownership? Why they were ready to allow the privatization processes? Or also, when you look at the West, why the people in the West thought that private is more effective, is better, and so on. Why there was not a real movement, and in the GDR, a real principle to organize possibilities that the individual could really act, could feel herself and himself as an owner. So, and learning from that and learning from the privatization processes in the West without resistance, we developed an idea, the energy table, we developed an idea how to organize assemblies of consumers of energy and to involve people in energy projects in cooperation with the public enterprise. So yeah, it means it is necessary to look for innovative forms to make the private, to make the public really public, to bring also the individual to meetings with other to learn about the energy system, about energy use, and so on. It is a collective learning. It is something new. It could be interesting, and it is a step to establish a real democratic control of the public enterprises. So, and our idea as the energy table is also to meet as much as possible with the management of the two public enterprises, because we think public is a challenge for us, and we want to win them for changing the energy system as a whole, not only in making it better, but also in making it more democratic, more solidarity, and so on. But of course, it is connected with conflicts. So, and the last, two last remarks.
Okay.
Okay, later.
No, yet.
Okay, may I add?
Yes.
Okay. So when Dario spoke about class, race, and gender, I think it is, of course, correct. I also connected the comments with societal hierarchies I spoke about, but it is necessary to make it concrete, and we did it. Because when we organized the referendum, we had to face another conflict, because the law doesn't allow the participation of people living in Berlin but haven't any German passport. So they cannot participate in the referendum. But we invited the people which are without the permission to participate, to join and to sign. Of course, it was a challenge for us because so it was necessary to bring much more signatures to the table than when you look and count only the signatures of the people who are allowed to participate in the referendum. But it was a political act, and we explained that we are against the law, that the people living in Berlin but haven't any German passport cannot participate in the referendum. So, and such things are also necessary to protect ourselves from attempts by the extreme right to occupy our projects. So, and a very last remark, I don't think that the market is a driver. You have to look at the agencies, the actors behind the market. I think we should be clearly in using terms, not to support such moves and ideologies to show the people that they cannot do anything because the market. This is not the market. We have to show the concrete actors behind the market. But only.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you. So, Dario, what do you want to add to this discussion?
Thank you. I think that I would like to maybe expand on a few things. One is the question of, like, I think that Judith is very right without making with the thing that we have to make it concrete, and we have to also not only make it concrete in such things, but also, like, just an example. If you can create very participative structures at work, or regarding, like, the first plans that were that obviously did not come through, unfortunately, about the energy table, but like with the monthly neighborhood assemblies, with the discussions with the energy communal energy provider. But if you don't if you don't break up the patriarchal childcare system, then you don't create the possibility that women can also participate in that, for example, at the same extent as others can. And so I think there's a lot of examples where this is where this somehow connects. But from my investigation and from the research I've done, for example, in like recuperated workplaces, and I wrote about it as the idea of labor as commoning. These are spaces, they don't solve everything, but they're spaces where you can discuss these things much better than in any other workplace or situation that is under the absolute capitalist and market command. So it's like, we should obviously not expect that it can solve everything, but we can create with that spaces where a discussion can come up, and where a solution for those problems can be looked for or discussed. About the state, I think that I agree that there's no way to ignore the state, and that the state should be somehow also a level of intervention of the left. But I have a problem, like, first of all, with a lot of the leftist parties that exist in Europe and beyond, because once they are in these state structures, in these institutional structures, they tend more to look for the solution as a coalition of existing party programs than in mobilizing a different majority of people on a different basis. And that's not because they're especially bad or whatever, but because, first of all, there is very little organic and obligatory connection between the parties and the rank and file movements, which obviously then makes like this, that they take over this rather liberal conception of that they're there and then they act according to their convictions or whatever. And the second one is that the state has an inherent logic. It's not that it's like the neutral ground where you can then come up with different things so easily. Yeah. So I think that we would need, like, the leftist forces that understand that the state is another battleground, and we have to be there. I'm not there, and I won't be there. It's not my interest, but like the ones that go there, that it is also a place of disruption. You have to disrupt to show the contradictions and to also claim the visibility for the people that don't have visibility. And you claim this visibility not by being part of the game, but by trying to disrupt it constantly. And I think that's like one important thing. The second thing is the state, that we have to be profoundly aware. I also say we claim the production, but obviously I don't mean that we just take the production and everything stays the same. And with the state, there's like the same problem. The state in Europe is a deeply racist structures nation state. It's based the idea of European nation state is based on racial hierarchies and on homogenization and on top-down military discipline. The military is the heart of how the European nation state was born, and there comes the homogenization that then is reflected onto the school system, which is part of this homogenization. So we have to decolonize this state completely because it's based on completely wrong. And I think that it's, when I get into discussions, it's often like, what do we define as state? And I think that, like, if we define state as the organization, let's say bottom-up organization of societies, then it doesn't have to be the European nation state that is the state. And not only it doesn't have to be, it can't be if we want a just transition and an equal and different relationship, not only between North and South, but also like the whole baggage of the idea of the participation of nationals, of how immigration is treated, of how like racial difference is treated, what gender roles are. That's deeply inscribed in the completely racist, colonial, and patriarchal idea of the nation state. So this state has to be decolonized deeply. And then the next, maybe the one more thing, I think that like it's especially important, and Hilary did some great work about that too. The question of putting like labor as common, because I mean we talk about like and liberals like to talk about to common everything, but never about labor. But I mean this whole society is based on labor and production, so we don't talk about that. How can be the rest turned into commons? Second, I think it's very important, and there like also struggles to be fought about the whole question of intellectual property and commons, because this is like, I mean, the expansion of intellectual property, the patents on medicine, on technological development, are what is today organizing marginalization, exclusion, capital extraction, and the huge problem of access to everything, from access to, I mean, I see that I'm teaching at different universities, from like state-owned universities, or like even in Mexico, or in the US, and then like elite universities like Cornell. There's a huge difference already to what kind of articles do students have access to. I mean, it's insane. Same thing about medicine. I mean, now they yesterday announced the first COVID cure is going to be on the market. It's going to be $2,000. The developers decided. So I mean, we can transform the whole healthcare system into commons, but if we don't expropriate and do commons, make commons out of the medicine production and the producers of medical equipment, they will make the state and the people pay for it so much that in 10 years we will have again a discussion about privatizing the healthcare system because it's not sustainable. So the question of commoning of knowledge in education and science, in patents, the elimination of patents, and all these things are fundamental. And I think and I want to add that it's a complete lie when people say that, oh yes, you have to be there and keep that, because if you don't have the companies and the developers earning something, there will be no development, no progress, nothing. I mean, I think we can look at the history, and the idea of private property and of private privatization of knowledge has has slowed down development. Capitalism is not able to develop anything unless in crisis. In capitalism, money goes where money flows. So it will not go into production or development, but in crisis, it goes into speculation. And that's what we see. Critical discussion of the state, but any kind of development, bigger development steps we had anywhere, be it in Latin America, be it in Southeast Asia or in Europe, like after the wars, during the times of the national liberation governments, or in the Tigers development, the semiconductor development in Southeast Asia and Japan, was all state-led. Was state organized and state led, because private capital is not developing anything. That's a myth. And I think that is something that we have to repeat and repeat again and again and make it clear.
Okay, thank you. So I have three words in mind concerning public and commons. It's commonifying, it's democratizing, and it's decolonizing. So these are the three words. Hilary, before I give you the word for your comments, I would just mention that Judith already mentioned your book, Reclaim the State: Experiments in Popular Democracy, but there are two others we should mention. The public service reform, but not as we know it, and the third one, left answering the free market rights. Okay, that's now, please, Hilary, go on.
Yeah, and there's one more. The last one was arguments for a new left, answering the free market right, and then the one I've just done is called A New Politics from the Left, and that concentrates very much on this question of knowledge, which I'll come on to. Maybe I should clarify the reference to the market that Judith picked up. Apologies. Because I was speaking to an audience of the left, and I didn't have much time, I used a bit the shorthand of the market, the private market. But I agree with Judith, if we were having a wider public discussion, we would need to make that more concrete, more vivid, and refer to particular agents. And even if we were analysing, we'd need to distinguish between the corporate monopoly or oligopoly driven market and the idea of exchange, which is can transcend capital, a capitalist market. Anyway, that's a longer discussion. So maybe I should come back on some of these ideas about the state. I think perhaps one area that is interesting is one that Judith talked about in talking about, the idea of forms of commons organization independent of the state. I think it differs. Different states, because it's a struggle, as Dario said, we're not talking about any kind of reliance on the state as it is. So it's a question of what kind of a struggle is possible and appropriate given the balance of forces and given the history of different nation states. So in Britain, the struggle around the refugees and asylum seekers is less. There's initiatives that are about immediate solidarity, but they're often the basis of then campaigns for the rights of those excluded citizens to have access to the NHS, sort of reclaiming the idea of universal provision. On the other hand, there are experiences of self-organization, which I'll refer to the feminist movement, because there, it's interesting, Dario referred to the significance of 68 as involving a kind of rupture from both capitalism and from the sort of command economy, and the development of movements in which participatory democracy was the driving force. He then leapt onto the Zapatistas, but I think that, we need to actually look at one of the most important movements for our discussion, which was more directly a product of '68, in conflict with some of the culture of '68, but that was the women's movement. And one aspect of the women's movement that's relevant here is that it refused the idea of deferred gratification, of sort of leaving it till after the revolution, till after a socialist government. We said, no, we need change now. We need collective forms of childcare now if we're to participate in the struggle. We need centres, protective centres for women facing domestic violence, for women facing rape. And so, in a way, we didn't believe we could rely on the state, even just demanding the state. We needed to organise those things now. So we did organise forms of collective childcare, forms of self-organised centres to protect women against domestic violence. And then on the basis of that self-organisation, we then demanded that we had public support, we had funds from the state. But those organisations, those self-organised organisations, were a kind of commons. I mean, they were a commons of childcare or a commons of security. And in a way there, the relationship with the state was from the beginning one of conflict and of struggle. And I think in a way that links on to the question that Dario raised about the nature of the struggle with the state. I mean, in Britain, as in Italy, as in Germany, I think, and in a way the energy table illustrates this. There are many experiences of not relying on representation in its atomized liberal form, but of combining parliamentary representation with extra parliamentary building of popular power. I mean, it's not been adequate. So we saw most tragically, in a way, in Greece, that Syriza did develop in the way that Dario describes, sort of becoming entangled and absorbed by the logic of the established state. And we've seen it in Britain with the Labour Party becoming increasingly absorbed into the imperial state with all its hierarchies. I mean, Jeremy Corbyn tried to break from that, but the very fact that he faced, when he became near to government, the most concerted attack is an illustration of the nature of the struggle with the state. But at a local level, maybe where the military is less powerful, and capital is less powerful, the link with the City of London is less powerful. We have been able to achieve some momentary experiences. They've been momentary because they've been a threat. I mean, I worked for the government of London, which was a very big organisation, which in the end was abolished by the Thatcher government because it was a threat. But we had a brief experience where we combined representation, and it was a kind of seeing representation not in the atomized sense of simply the voter, but of in a way making present that concept of representation. So making present within the legislative chamber the struggles of London's communities, struggles over property, over land, over resources, over labour, over employment. Those were made present, as it were, within the legislative chamber, but at the same time, the resources of the state and the function of the state that was progressive was redistribution. So London, as you know, is a city of inequality, and the creation of the Greater London Council was one that was based on the idea of redistributing the wealth of Hampstead and Westminster and so on to the east of London, to the poor places of London. So we use that redistributive power to then provide resources that were in a way delegated to the people of London to support their kind of struggles. So there are these examples which I think we can learn from. So I think maybe that's roughly what all I needed to say. So that concept of being in and against the state came from that experience, and I think it's a concept that we can hold on to. But it does mean a different kind of political party. It means a party that is really rooted within extra-parliamentary struggles. And I think also it involves a very different conception of knowledge. So in talking about a knowledge commons, we're talking not only about making scientific knowledge, codified knowledge, open, transparent, and shared, but also about recognizing the knowledge, the practical knowledge, what we could call tacit knowledge, skills of working class people. And that was absent. You know, the reason why public ownership originally in Britain was so top down was because the people advising the Labour government were, their conceptions of knowledge were completely elite. They literally denied the capacity of ordinary people to provide solutions. And we need an understanding of knowledge which recognizes and values that capacity, that skill. So it's linked to seeing Labour as a commons in the way that that Dario described. So I think we've got to we need political parties that no longer prioritize the idea of electoral power and representational power, but seize that kind of power. You could say we need a distinction between power as domination, which is power within the state, and power as transformative capacity, which is the power that movements have, that collective organization has in society, and that power as domination should be a resource for power as transformative capacity. So movements, parties that believe in transformation rhetorically need to be based far more on empowering movements rather than in subordinating movements in order to get into governmental office. And there are a lot of lessons from Italy there, as Roberto knows.
We all had our lessons to learn from Italy. Thank you very much. I give the last word to Roberto, because I think we have now some elements what we could discuss in September when Tommaso is available, and perhaps Hilary, you too. So I think this was a very, very productive and good discussion now. Thank you very much for participating in it, and hope to keep in touch and to continue. I think we are on a good way. Thank you. Now, Roberto.
Thanks to you, Birgit. Thanks to all of you, Dario, Hilary, Judith, and Tatiana behind the curtains. It's managing the question that we didn't receive. And so we used our time to enlarge your speech. And I'm glad to have the discussion, because it's an internal discussion, but it's also an open question how the left can, let's say, the term use the commons good, or the commons as you want to call it, as a point of reference in order to establish a view, a vision of the transformative reconstruction of the left. I think that we have many points on the table, many questions that are still without solution. But I think that we are. I think that what we use when we used to have this discussion, it's useful in order to understand that in the past we had the only progressive transformation of our society. It's after the Second War, and it was made by a very big struggle. It was a war. And what we miss now is the capacity to have this kind of vision. And I think that the Commons has the opportunity to give us also a new inspiration in order to reestablish a link between different aspects of our life. It's labor, it's healthcare, it's public, it's a state, it's what kind of relation we want to have each other and with the environment. So when we call the Commons strategy, we are talking also of a kind of new idea for the left behind the productive transformation, behind the relation of power between the class struggle we are used to use. So thanks a lot again to all of you, and I think we as Transform will follow this path, and I think we will use the opportunity to have not only Tommaso but also maps in the European Parliament in September in order to push them also to focus this kind of relation in the Parliament, but not only in the Parliament. As Hilary says, we need to rebuild movements on this field. But I think that there are a lot of movements indeed in the future. Fridays for Future are part of this discourse, so I think that we can have the opportunity to have a good discussion in September and to enter deeply in the political field and try to focusing better the Commons as a political project. Say this, thank you again, all of you. Thanks the people that are watching us. Of course, we recorded this video and we will put on our website. And I take the opportunity to say goodbye to everybody and have a good summer. And maybe not so good experiences in these days, but I hope that at summertime we will have the opportunity to travel a lot, at least for some meter behind the barrier. Ciao, everybody.
Thank you. Bye. Have a great summer.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye. Ciao.
Ciao.
Bye.
And thanks, Tatiana. Ciao.
Ciao, Tatiana. Ciao, Birgit.
Ciao.
Diana.
Okay.